name is Vlad Bunea. Actually, I used to be a professor when I was much younger, before I even came to Canada from Romania. And now I do full-time activism and writing. I quit the financial industry last year. So this presentation, it's about heterodox economics. In this model, which I call the 3-4 model of capitalism, I included my understanding of how capitalism works and my approach to it, which comes from a degrowth angle. I am the founder of the Degrowth Collective and a co-founder of the International Degrowth Network. If we have time, I can tell you more about that. So developing this model helped me understand the fundamental principles and the elements that drive the capitalist economy. So I was driven to answer the one question, which was, what are the most fundamental concepts that explain the workings of capitalism? In this lecture, we will try to answer 4 questions. What is heterodox economics? What is the 3-4 model of capitalism that I designed? How does the model fit with everything else? And what is it good for? How does it affect our lives? So let's look first at heterodox economics. These are the explanations from the Handbook of Heterodox Economics, published by Routledge. Heterodox economics is conventionally perceived as being in opposition to the dominant position that is orthodox in the intellectual sense, or mainstream economics, which is in the sociological sense. It can also be defined in terms of what it rejects, often implying erroneously that it does not have its own body of theory and policy. A more positive definition of heterodox economics, which is a body of economic theory and policy developed and practiced independently of mainstream economics. So this is where I fit in, and this is where schools of thought like degrowth fits in the heterodox camp. Now, if we look at Wikipedia, we see this complicated graph of a lot of economic theories, histories, and authors, and how it led up to the present understanding of heterodox economics. However, this picture is severely incomplete because it doesn't talk, for example, about feminist economics, ecological economics, degrowth, steady state economics, post-growth. One of the theories that you see on this graph, it's modern monetary theory at the top. It's one of my favorites, and it is largely viewed as heterodox, but the more it is discussed in the media and in theory and articles, it becomes more mainstream. So it might become an orthodox theory. For the time being, it remains a heterodox theory. It's very interesting. If we have time, we can also talk about modern monetary theory a bit later. Now let's see the 3-4 model of capitalism. We have a nice diagram here in colors. What is this? This is a mode, it's a tool for understanding how the economy works and how to identify the hidden truths in the economic narrative and how to evaluate government policy. Did not mean to replace other models. This is you can understand as a functional and descriptive model. I do not put markets, wage labor, and private property inside the definition. I leave out markets. Wage labor, for example, I see it as a symptom in capitalism, not as the core defining principle. Same as free markets, they do not define capitalism, as we will see in a moment. And I would even argue that many elements and arrangements of our current economic system are a manifestation of a more fundamental arrangement in the economy, which is this model that you see here. And actually, the model has 7 elements, 3 spheres, 3 doctrines in the arrows between the spheres, and the growth incentive at the middle. I call it the 3-4 model because it has this pattern of 3 elements repeating. We will unpack them in a moment. So in words, this is how I would define it. So capitalism is the economic system that is represented by the spheres of property, power, and capital that are linked through the doctrines of proportionality at the top, dispossession on the left, and hierarchies on the right, with the growth incentive at the core. So this is, you can say, a definition of capitalism from this perspective. Traditionally, classical definition of capitalism would sound something like this: a mode of economic organization that seeks to maximize returns to the owners of wealth, with its core operating system based on private property, number one, wage labor, number two, and the market mechanism. Another definition sounds like an economic system based on private property and markets that depends on many people having nothing to sell but their labor. And above all, it prioritizes delivering profit for the owners of wealth. So you can see the key words in the traditional definitions of capitalism. It's all about private property, markets, labor, and profit. We move now to unpack those elements in the model. Let's look at property first, which is the blue circle right there. So it has several elements. In principle, property does not have a universal definition in the world, but capitalism forces the definition that it's focused on the exclusion of others. So we will see what that means. So basically, property is everything that can be owned by humans directly or indirectly. Property can be things, land, buildings, ideas, money, promises, shares in a company, and so on. In society, it is largely accepted that property is represented not just by what it is owned, but also by the social relationships, the laws and the rules that come with what is owned. For example, you can own your house. That means it is yours, it belongs to you. At the same time, your house comes with rules, such as only you can sell it, only you can decide who lives in it, only you can make changes to it, only you have the right to refuse others to enter your house. These are some of the rights that come with property. Property at the same time is not capital, but it can easily become capital. This is a very important distinction because usually in orthodox theories, there's a confusion between property and capital. For example, a house can become a place of work. Let's say like it happened during COVID. If you suddenly have to work and produce from it, from inside it, then white land can become agricultural land also through legal mechanisms. So this is when property becomes capital, when it starts producing in the economy. But in order for this to happen, you need a legal framework. You need the state to agree to that and recognize it. Some examples, like we discussed, is the land itself. And it's important to note here that capitalism wants to understand natural resources, such as land, through the Western definition of property. When we talk about land enclosures, which is pretty much putting fences around the land, which is a phenomenon started in the 1500s in England, some argue that was the beginning of capitalism, when property became framed within boundaries, so it can become capital for landowners at a later time. The same happens with personal data, that it's our data, such as our names, our date of birth, our health status, everything we do, our shopping habits, that it's generally considered personal data. And it's used by big tech as capital. They use it to sell, for example, our personal data to advertisers and to make a profit from it. So that's an example of how property becomes capital. Now let's talk about the relationships between power and property. They are managed through the doctrine of proportionality. And the relationship about property and capital is managed through the doctrine of dispossession, which is one of the double arrows you can see on the left. So this is how property links with the other elements. The next element in the model is power. It's the green circle right there, has itself a few elements. One of the first elements is that power is considered as an ability to cause something to happen according to your will. A caveat to this happens regardless of whether free will exists or not. And I will argue that free will, it does not exist. It's a very important conversation to have within the heterodox economics camp. But we operate with the assumption that we have free will to decide what we do. Now let's take some examples, like from culture, popular culture. I've watched this series called Billions, in which a billionaire, Bobby Axelrod at the bottom, played by Damian Lewis, his archenemy at the top, played by Paul Giamatti, he ordered his minions to buy and sell shares for his trading company. He ordered his employees to destroy the lives of others, and everyone executed the orders. Another example is the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, which is based on a real story of Jordan Belfort, who also was a trader on Wall Street. He also ordered his employees to do the same. He ordered his servants to tend to his whims, no questions asked. This is power express. Another quality of power or attribute is that it is a social status that permits you, allows you to express the ability that we just discussed. It's a role that gives you a power. So we have two presidents here. Joe Biden at the top, a millionaire and a career politician that largely never antagonized affluence in the capitalist system. And at the bottom is Jose Mujica, sitting at a table with the president of Argentina. Jose Mujica was a former president of Uruguay who has been described as the world's humblest head of state due to his austere lifestyle and his donation of around 90% of his $12,000 a month salary to charities that benefited the poor and small entrepreneurs. What do they have in common, both Mujica and Biden? They both had a function, a role, a job that gave them the power, a social status. And a third element of power is what I see as a network of humans that have a common interest. One example is the World Economic Forum, that is infamous for organizing the yearly Davos Forum. It's actually happening right now. It started yesterday and it goes on until the February 24th, I think. So at that forum in Switzerland, billionaires tell us what we need to do to save the planet pretty much. So we have to listen to them. So it's a network of rich people. Another example is the Atlas Network, little known by the general public, and because they do not advertise as much, which comprises of over 500 organizations in over 100 countries, and it is focused on promoting what they call economic freedom, and imagine air quotes right now. But it is not the freedom of individuals. It is the freedom of economic agents, specifically corporations. They do this because they have the power of influence and they have the power to establish the narrative. So this is what power looks like in a nutshell. And the power links with capital through the doctrine of hierarchies is the third double arrow in the image, which we will discuss in a moment. And the last element, the last sphere, is capital itself, the red circle. Roughly speaking, capital is whatever is used in the production of goods and services. It is made from two ingredients, an asset and the legal code. Important to note that not all assets are created equal. Capital is formalized, it's made real, tangible, through the legal code. Pretty much, if the law says that something is capital, then it becomes capital through the stroke of a pen. It is as simple as that. So these are the attributes of assets which makes them candidates for being capital. So this description comes from a book called The Code of Capital by legal scholar Katarina Pistor. So these attributes are four of them. First one is priority, which ranks competing claims to the same assets. So for example, if there's a lien for a mortgage on a house, a lien is like a right that is put on the property deed of a house, then the bank has priority over others to get the money from you when you sell the house. So that's priority. Durability is an attribute which extends priority claims in time. So it just makes priority last for a long period until the claim is satisfied. So for example, until you sell the house, you pay off the mortgage. If that's the case, that gives durability to the asset. Universality, which extends these attributes in space. It usually refers to the fact that everyone must respect the attributes of assets, regardless of where they are on Earth, pretty much in society. And the last attributes, convertibility, operates as an insurance device that allows holders to convert their private credit claims into state money on demand and thereby protect their nominal value. For only legal tender can be a true store of value. Now, okay, let's pause for a moment because this sounds a bit jargony, because I wanted to get the exact quote from the book. Legal tender refers usually to what is known as official money, like the dollar. For example, Bitcoin is not official money because it's not recognized by the state as a currency used in transactions. So for an asset count as capital, it must be convertible into legal tender, into an official currency. I don't say that Bitcoin cannot become at some point legal tender, but it's not there yet. And I certainly hope it doesn't get there for many reasons. So let's look at some example of assets that have become capital through the legal code, like we discussed about a home becoming a place of work. In fact, during COVID, when I worked from home, I could write off some of my income because the government recognized that part of my home was used for business, for work as capital. We discussed how land become enclosed. It's also through these attributes and through the legal code. We also discussed how personal data becomes capital by being harvested by the big tech companies. So all these operations follow the same principle, the same rules, and they also need the backing of the legal code. Now let's see how an asset becomes capital a little in more depth. These are specifically the legal devices that are used by law to transfer assets into capital. I think there's more, but let's look at these ones. There are contract law, property rights, collateral law, trust law, corporate law, and bankruptcy law. So these tools, you should know, and it's largely not discussed a lot in literature, have not been recognized even by some heterodox schools of thought, such as the Marxian school, as being important elements that hold capitalism together. And Katerina Piskol argues that these elements are super duper important in keeping capitalism alive. And I happen to agree with her. If any theory wants to phase out capitalism, being, I don't know, anarchism or socialism or whatever, must also redesign all these legal devices. Without redesigning law, like from the bottom up, we cannot have a different system. These elements are included in what I call the doctrine of dispossession. It's the double arrow between property and capital, which we'll unpack in a moment. An interesting caveat and maybe a tidbit from history. Before capitalism, the doctrine of dispossession was used to be known as the doctrine of discovery, was invented by the Catholic Church as a moral code and justification for the colonization of North America and pretty much the rest of the world. It just changed the name. I use dispossession to make reference to events that are happening today. So this is one way in which legal devices operate, the famous terms and conditions on social platforms, social media platforms, which are essentially contract. It's between us, the users, and the providers, the big tech companies, in which we agree to allow our asset, namely the personal data that we have, to become capital for big tech. This is the device. This is how they use it, this text, and is backed by law. And whoever reads the terms and conditions, nobody ever reads the terms and conditions. Even if we read them and chose not to accept them, we would not have access to those services.
Vlad, can I interrupt you a quick second?
Yes, please.
If you go back to the attributes of the assets,
yes,
rarity, durability, universality, and convertibility. As one of our students here, Ehren, asks, Can you elaborate on those attributes from the data example? Because and you keep talking about the personal data example. How does priority,
Yes.
durability, how do these four attributes apply to the data example?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. There's a lot of analysis of how social media platforms operate. One book that comes to mind is called Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, in which she explains how assets are used to become capital for the purpose of what she calls behavior modification. So let's say priority. When Facebook collects personal data from us, like through our comments, through our interactions, the priority that is constructed in that transaction is that Facebook has the first access right to your personal data, and they alone decide how that data is sold to advertisers. Personal data on social media platforms is also managed through algorithms. So, and the physical infrastructure to manipulate our personal data, all that infrastructure qualifies as an asset that has these attributes. The durability of, let's say, the server farms of Facebook, since they own them, they are durable in the sense that nobody else can take them away from them. Only Facebook has access to them. Interesting, there was this conversation about TikTok, whether to be banned or sold in the US to a US owner. What that would have meant was that all these attributes like priority, who would have access to the TikTok infrastructure, durability for how long, who to exclude from accessing those servers, who can sell them, that would have been transferred to a US owner. I hope that makes sense. I hope this answers the question. It's a bit technical because it involves a lot of infrastructure and algorithms and all of that.
Yeah, no, that's great, Vlad. That brings it a bit more concrete. Thank you.
Yeah, I was looking for examples. And was there a question about land or just personal data?
The question was around data, but I think we can get the idea of how, because data is less tangible. I think that's where the question came from. But yes, of course, as we know from ecological economics as well, even things that are in the cloud have a tangible footprint, material and energy footprint anyway.
Yes.
And because of the laws and the things that you described further on, that's how these attributes apply to personal data as well.
Yes, they always do. Data always has a material footprint because it has to be stored on some hard drive or some, a physical device. So let's go back at the doctrine of proportionality. This is where the juicy territory begins. And why is that? Because property, power, and capital, if left alone, they don't do much by themselves. We need something to make them do something. And that's where the doctrines come in, which are, so to speak, the rules of engagement. If you look at the dictionary definition, a doctrine is something like a principle or a body of principles presented for acceptance or belief, whether it's religious, political, scientific, or philosophic, a dogma, a rule or principle of law, especially when established by precedent. One perfect example of the embodiment of this doctrine is how the share-based corporations operate. And they operate, most of them, on the principle of one share equals one vote. All corporations have to have a charter, which is submitted to the government, and that's how they all recognize the organization. And on that charter, you will see articles defining how many shares they have, how many classes of shares, because they can come in different categories, who owns them in what percentage, and what rights come with each share, because shares themselves, they are not made equal. So, for example, Mark Zuckerberg owns about 51% of Meta. That gives him, it's in the millions of shares, that gives him 51% of the votes that come with those shares. And the votes are expressed in the board of directors. And those votes are the basis for decisions in corporations. So this is the principle of one human having X number of shares. And this is the power distribution that happens in capitalism, which is the doctrine of proportionality. If we compare this to liberal democracy, to the political sphere, we see that capitalism is not very democratic, because in the political sphere, we have the principle of one human equals one vote when we elect our political representatives. So the big difference is that the vote is linked to a person in liberal democracy, and in capitalism, a vote is linked to a share, not a human. And the share is like a legal abstraction. The share has the vote, and the human can be considered like just like the voice for that share. If that share had the brain, it would speak for itself. This is how I put those mini mouths speaking, each to next S representing the share. So this is the core of how the doctrine of proportionality works in capitalism. And this goes back to the 1600s with the creation of the first share-based companies like the East India Company or the Dutch India Company, where they issued shares. They created a share market in the Netherlands and then in the UK, where people can buy just a portion of that company, a share of that company, and therefore having a proportional say in what happened with that company and a proportional revenue from that company. Now, there's a long conversation about why this is wrong and how it can be changed. We will only look at two examples of a different system of how this arrangement can be done in the economy. The first one is the participatory socialism model proposed by economist Thomas Piketty. In this system, a single stockholder owning 100% of the company's stock, so it's number one here in the graph. Let me turn on the laser pointer. So here, this is one person. So they own 100% of the company's stock, and they have 73% of voting rights if the company has 2 salaried employees, including himself. Then they would have 51% if he has 10 salaried employees. This is 10, including himself. And that person loses the majority beyond 10 salaried employees. So this is when the line is below 50%. Then this share declines regularly and it reaches 5% with 100 salaried, and I would say plus here at the right. This model proposed by Thomas Piketty is trying to address the question of proportionality. It seems like he's asking, should we still keep proportionality? It seems that he answers yes, but only to some extent. So this is why he blends proportion with representation by one person equals one vote. And he proposes this gradual evolution of this combination of shares versus individual votes. Another model comes from Isabel Ferreras. It's called the bicameral firm, in which a company operates pretty much like a parliament with 2 chambers. Like Piketty, Isabel Ferreras wants to find a compromise. So she has envisioned a chamber of representatives of the capital investors, which are the shareholders of the companies, who still operate on the principle of one share equals one vote. And there's another chamber of representatives of the labor investors, which are essentially the employees, the workers in the company, who operate on the principle of one person equal one vote. Now, these 2 chambers form the so-called two-chamber parliament that would roughly replace the board of directors in a traditional corporation. Majority vote has a veto power, so they decide what happens in the company based on majority vote. They elect the executive committee, the top management, that in turn elects all the other directors and employees in the company. So it seems like it's a compromise to the system that we have right now. We will move now to the doctrine of dispossession, which is the link between property and capital. It's the double arrow on the left. Dispossession comes in many shapes and forms. Remember, we talked briefly about the legal devices in which assets become capital. I will focus on just a few examples of dispossession. I will look first at dispossession with consent and without consent. Here we have our friend Karl Marx. he goes on TikTok and uses pixel sunglasses for some reason. Not sure why. This is how I found him, because he knows he's cool. But he recognized since the 1850s that workers have no chance but to willingly sell their labor, their skills and time for a wage. And this appears to be a form of consent, really, but is it? Is it really in reality? And this is how even Marx understood that capitalism operates with a lot of apparent consent from us. It's like assuming that we give our consent to whatever happens at the workplace without actually asking our input for all the decisions that happen there. More examples from our world. This is the Netflix series, The Playlist. It's about how Spotify was created. Their owner, Daniel Ek, now a billionaire, struggles to create Spotify in Sweden. He thinks that, okay, we have a lot of users who want to listen to all the music that has ever been created on Earth. On the other side, we have the artists, the music creators that provide those services. And we also have the middlemen who used to be represented by the recording studios and the distributors. So he thought about how to combine all these elements and create a platform to benefit everyone. So it seems, but in reality, what happened, he still used property through dispossession to create capital. So he used property, which let's say was the songs that were created by artists that became capital for Spotify, because it is Spotify itself that promotes that content. It's not the artists themselves. They have to go through Spotify. This is how asset becomes capital. And his benefit, he takes a cut from all those plays. He has revenue. We talked about personal data, but I think we can skip this because we discussed a bit more personal data, but it's the same principle. More tangible is how we sell labor and time and skills for money. When we apply for jobs, we consent to give away our time and skills to an employer who will use them to make a profit. This is a transaction. This is a contract that assumes consent. But in the end, and you don't need to be a Marxist to understand this, it is a form of dispossession because we are the effective owners of our brains, our skills, our time, and we have to give it away in this apparent consensual transaction to an employer. Now we move to dispossession without consent because this is also happening. Technofeudalism is a term invented by economist Yanis Varoufakis. We'll come to him in just a moment because I would like to look at two other examples before that. This documentary, Yinta, discusses the struggles of the indigenous nations in Western Canada in BC, the Wet'suwet'en, against the development of their land for the purpose of fossil fuel extractions and the gas pipeline. But this struggle that shown in Yinta, and I recommend you watch it, I think it's on Netflix, it's only one of the thousands of many struggles described here on the Environmental Justice Atlas that happen all around the world. So you can think of each dot here representing a struggle of dispossession without the consent of the owners of the local assets, if we want to use the terminology of capitalism. But if you ask the Wet'suwet'en, they wouldn't think themselves as the owners of that land, but more of the stewards of the land. So even the understanding of property is different from their perspective. And now we come back to technofeudalism, which is a way of describing capitalism more in line with how feudalism works. Yanis Varoufakis thinks that we no longer live in capitalism because the platforms such as Amazon do not operate on the market anymore. They are the market themselves. So once you enter Amazon, you give up all your privileges as a consumer that you used to have when you were going like to a farmer's market, and you have to respect the rules of Amazon. And Amazon has sole power, absolute power of what happens on their website. They decide what products you see in your searches. They can discriminate on price. This is not just Amazon. Almost all platforms tend to adopt this behavior. And why is this happening? Because they can. And the main difference between technofeudalism and let's say Facebook and dispossession with consent is that there is a layer of personal data harvesting to which we would not normally agree if we knew about it. This is very important because let's say we agree to the terms and conditions of Facebook, roughly speaking. But do we actually agree to how Amazon operates? Would we agree, for example, to, let's say, a small business owner that wants to sell their products on Amazon? Do we agree that their product would not be shown in the search result if they did not pay Amazon enough for that privilege? We would not agree to that. But there's a growing sphere of decisions to which we do not participate, but we consent, so to speak, against our will. So I would call that dispossession without consent. And this is how most platforms want to operate these days. The next doctrine is the hierarchies that manages the relationship between power and capital. Essentially, in a typical corporation, every hierarchical level that you see in a chart is selected top down, is accountable bottom up, and has absolute power over lower levels. Let's unpack this for a moment. So managers are always appointed or selected or hired from the upper level. They are never elected by the lower level, by the team members. They are always accountable to their managers, never to their employees in terms of performance and etc. And they have almost absolute power over what happens below them, of course, with directions coming from above, with no say whatsoever from their employees, their reports, how it's called in the corporate world. And a question that comes to my mind often, why are managers not elected by workers below their hierarchical level? And the simple answer is because they can, because it's allowed by the system, which doesn't even have to codify this into law. It just happens. It's not challenged. So we think. But if we look at the world, we wonder if hierarchies are everywhere. And there are plenty of examples where hierarchies can exist or cannot exist or do not exist, and an economic system can still happen. One example is the cooperative movement and the cooperative business model, in which the owners of the company can be the members of a community, such as the consumers or a local community. And those members elect the board of directors, and those board of directors elect the CEO and then the VPs and directors, etc. This example is from Van Cities, a financial cooperative founded in 1946 in BC. And they are a cooperative. They do not have shareholders. Their owners are the members of the community. So if you open an account with Van City or other financial cooperative, you automatically become an owner of that company, and you have a say in what happens there. Below the executive level, even some cooperatives maintain hierarchies. So if you're an employee of Van City, you cannot elect your manager. But there are other models in which you can. Another completely different model is what is known as decentralized participatory groups. And these happen at the community level. In northern Syria, largely a region that was not controlled by the rebels and mostly occupied by the Kurds, when they saw that the government did not care much about them, they decided to organize themselves. So they used teachings from anarchism. They read Murray Bookchin, one of the famous anarchist authors, and they say, okay, let's have no elected bosses. Let's organize our community by ourselves. So they have these communities. Here is a women's issues meeting in Kamshli. And they just talked about issues. They did not have bosses and they did not have hierarchies, and it works just fine. And there are many, many others examples like this working at community levels that I encourage you to research. So this wraps up the doctrine section. So we'll approach the a bit more a difficult section of the presentation. We still have growth to talk about. So what is growth? Specifically economic growth. Almost all theories orthodox and heterodox understand economic growth as what is measured by the gross domestic product. So when you see headlines in the news, something like here on the right side, the Canadian economy to see reasonable growth in Q1 2025, etc., what they actually mean is economic growth and specifically the growth of the GDP, the gross domestic product. And the GDP is the market value of all final goods and services that are bought and sold inside a nation in a given year. Everything that has a price and exchanges hands during a year counts as the GDP. So you can build rankings of nations according to this metric, and you can see that the larger the economy, the more economic agitation you have inside a country, the higher the GDP. Sometimes it correlates with population, such as China. Not always, but population does play a role, of course. But the more money moves around, the more goods and services, the higher the GDP. And this metric was invented in the 20th century by Simon Kuznets with the intent of measuring how effective the production for the Second World War was. But even the inventor of the GDP advocated against this invention. He said that it might hijack our attention from what really mattered in the economy. And why is that? Because let's look at some examples. All these are adding to economic growth. The military industry, every time you produce guns and ammo for a price and you go to war, it's good for the GDP. Deforestation is good for the GDP. Fossil fuel pipelines, like the documentary Yinta talks about, it's good for the GDP. Plastics, awesome for the GDP. Luxury, good for the GDP. For-profit private schools, whether they are good or not, they are still good for the GDP. Is not good for GDP, meaning what does not count for economic growth, a fresh untouched river, caring for family, dolphins, a nice walk, and almost everything that actually matters for happiness and well-being does not count for the GDP, including your free time, including reading or teaching children in your community or doing any sorts of volunteer work. It doesn't matter for the economy. Let's see how theory looks at growth. Theories of economic growth usually explain how growth happens, but not for what purpose. And remember, we are talking about heterodox economic theory right now. One example is the Herod and Domer model, and this is an actually quote from the handbook. And I'll read it to you, and then we will translate into human English. So this model is used in development economics to explain an economy's growth rate in terms of the level of saving and of capital. It suggests that there's no natural reason for an economy to have balanced growth. There are three kinds of growth: warranted growth, actual growth, and the natural rate of growth. Warranted growth is a rate of growth at which the economy does not expand indefinitely or goes into a recession. Actual growth is the real rate increase in a country's GDP per year. And natural growth is the growth an economy requires to maintain full employment. See, even Herod Domar doesn't look at all the elements of capitalism. They look at growth in terms of employment, which is jobs, and resources. Just want to explain that what they mean by full employment, not when everybody has a job, but when everybody who wants to have a job has a job. So if you're willingly not participating in employment, you do not count in this definition. Michal Kalecki, another famous economist, has a different approach to growth. So he thinks that the model capitalist system is characterized by imperfect competition, and the firms are the price makers. They set the markup, also known as a profit margin, over cost, depending on the degree of oligopoly. An oligopoly is when there are very few sellers of the same product on the market. So you may think of Google an oligopolist. The formal operation of capitalism generates both excess capacity and unemployment. Capacity means how much stuff, how much capital there is available inside an economy to work with, to produce new goods and services. A key argument from Kalecki is that the level of demand for the goods affects the capacity utilization rate. So how much of that stuff you utilize in your production, and long run growth is driven by investment. So he thinks that growth, economic growth, is decided by how much companies invest in that stuff, in that capital. When they invest a lot, there's growth. This makes the analysis of the determinants of investment important. In the short run, an increase in oligopolization leads to increasing markups and a redistribution of income in favor of profits, which then has a negative impact on investment through its negative effect of aggregate demand. Okay, now this is economic theory, pure and simple. So he says that when companies become more and more powerful, like Google, more oligopolist, they increase their margins. They make more profit margins. And then they redistribute that income from their operations towards profit and less towards investment. And that has a negative effect on aggregate demand, which is what us, the consumers, have vis-a-vis their products. So he thinks growth happens only when there's less oligopolies, when there's more competition on the market. So as you can see, he still operates with the assumptions of proportionality, dispossession, and hierarchies. Robert Rothorn thinks that economic growth is led by wage salaries. In an economy operating below full capacity, which we discussed, an increase in nominal wages, like salaries that we have, the gross salary, leads to an increase in the share of wages within total income. So this is the total income of a nation. When salaries have a larger proportion in the income of a nation, he thinks they have more power to drive economic growth. As a result, a higher utilization of capital, the stuff that we talked about, is observed. So we see companies using more capital, and profits on the existing capital stock increase. So they make more profits because they use more capital. In the process, it is also possible that increased capacity utilization leads to economies of scale, also known as globalization, and this will counteract the increased cost of higher wages. This is a more sophisticated way of describing globalization, which he thinks that economies of scale may result in growth or it may not result in growth. It all depends on how much people are paid and how they use the money to buy stuff, and all of this pumps up the entire economic engine and GDP. Two other authors, Amit Baduri and Stephen Marglin, they look at investments and savings, and they think that they are functions of the profit share and capacity utilization, which is an indicator of expected demand. This is another jargon term. Expected demand is what the companies think we, the consumers, will want from them, how much they think we will buy from them. Their use of the profit share instead of the profit rate stems from the argument that when investment is specified as a function of capacity utilization and the profit rate, this specification makes only wage-led growth possible and rules out the possibility of profit-led growth. So when wages lead growth, they are linked with low investments. This system is called stagnationist at the bottom. It's called accelerationist when it's led by profits. In this profit-led system, its investment responds strongly to profitability. So when a company is profitable and they make a lot of profits, they move to a profit-led growth. So they let profits drive the growth. So, and in this case, a higher profit share leads to a higher capacity utilization. Again, the stuff that counts as capital. We see the structural approach that emphasizes the importance of different structures across sectors and countries. One example comes from ECLAC. This approach argues that the world economy should be considered as a whole, within which a center and a periphery can be identified. The center can be thought of as the global north, the rich countries, and the periphery, the developing countries, the poor countries, or also known as the global south. The center and the periphery have structural differences that, when they are taken together, create an international division of labor and a single world economic system. And in this system, growth in the periphery, in the global south, depends on the conditions in the center. The periphery specializes in low value added products, mostly agricultural products, cheap labor, cheap land, etc. And this specialization leads to a trade dependent growth path. In other words, the rules determined in the global north, in the rich countries, are driving the growth in the south. This is a very important topic in degrowth literature, which we might have time to discuss a little later. So structural approach comes closer to describing this. The Marxian approach to growth sees the economy as two classes, the capitalists and the workers, with an unlimited labor supply and an income distribution determined by class struggle, the fight between the two classes. In this economy, workers do not save, and capitalists use their savings for investment, which expands output and employment. Hence, in the classical Marxian model, growth depends on savings, which leads to capital accumulation. So only when you have extra money, you can have capital accumulation. This is the Marxian approach. And degrowth sees growth as the engine of the system. This is the focus of my work. And what is the purpose of growth? Survival and domination with no concern of consequences. What explains the growth incentives? I think it's behavioral economics, determinism, anthropology, culture. It's not what we are used to hearing in economic theory, mostly in orthodox theories, in some heterodox theories. So to understand what drives growth, we have to look in those areas, mostly in behavioral economics. And it's a very long conversation, which unfortunately we don't have time for today. So just for everyone to understand what degrowth is, this is a definition in words, is the expansion of social agency and well-being for all humans within the limits of Earth by reducing production and consumption to lighten ecological footprint, planned democratically in the spirit of social justice. There's a lot packed into this definition, so every word that's in a different color has an entire literature, maybe a whole book or books behind it. I would like to highlight from this definition the reduction of production and consumption and planned democratically. In other words, is putting the economy on a diet by a bottom-up approach so we come back in harmony with nature. This is the degrowth approach to phasing out the growth incentive. Now, the next question we had on the agenda for today, how does this model fit with everything else? There's a list of heterodox theories that I highlighted for this example, and here's how I see they relate to this model. And degrowth and feminist economics come closer to addressing all the elements that we discussed today. Growth, property, power, capital, and the three doctrines. The other theories address different aspects of capitalism. And I would say even post-Keynesian economics talks about the elements, but they see them as symptoms of this of capitalism. They don't see as the fundamental principles. And remember at the beginning I said the question I was trying to answer with this model is, what are the most fundamental concepts that explain the workings of capitalism, so we can clear the confusion, what is cause and effect, and what is a symptom, and what is illness. These are just headlines that I found in the news last week. U.S. lawsuit accuses Pepsi company of price discrimination that favor Walmart over smaller stores. Why is this possible? Because Pepsi is an oligopolist. BMO becomes first Canadian bank to withdraw from Net Zero Banking Alliance. Why is this possible? Because BMO executes the will of executives, not its employees or its customers. It's using the doctrine of proportionality and hierarchies for this decision. Gas price expert: if Canada or US go toe-to-toe on tariffs, consumers will pay dearly. Tariffs are used to protect the status quo and the hegemony of the system. So governments usually react, and I would say all the time, to protect this model. So when you see tariffs, it's governments protecting the hegemony of the system. It's protecting this model with all these doctrines. And if they think tariffs protects the system, they will do tariffs. Passive investing may be the best strategy for retirement saving. This refers to passive income, which is about the stock market, which is all about proportionality, which is telling you, okay, invest in the stock market, let the money work for you. And passive income is having money without work, pretty much. And this is what the stock market is all about. It's a casino that dances around the doctrine of proportionality and tries to sell us the story that we can have an income without working. Inflation, what inflation? Bonds tell us about economic era we're in. This is a more difficult example to see how it links to the model, because we are never told that inflation is caused by companies raising prices. And why they do that? It's because they can. We mostly hear that companies react and they increase prices because of, some government policy. But in the end, whether it's government or not, the company raises the price, not the government. And they do that because they have the power to do so. Employees navigate an increasingly soul-crushing job market rife with fake listing and ghosting hiring managers. As we discussed, the job market is a symptom of the doctrine of hierarchies. We have the job market because we have the doctrine of hierarchies. It's not the other way around. If we think about replacing this system, I'll take just a few minutes to show you this bonus question. What would it mean to change capitalism from the perspective of the threefold model? So phasing out these doctrines would mean abolishing the stock market, phasing out the labor market. Managers will be selected by employees, not vice versa. Property cannot be turned into capital without full informed consent by owner. Business models will become cooperative. Housing may become a human right. It will be decommodified. Nature can be restored because it can no longer be owned privately. Market crashes will become a thing of the past. The financial industry will no longer dominate the economy. And these are just some highlights of the consequences of replacing the capitalist model, like is described here, with a different kind of economy. And degrowth, as I see it, happens to be one leading theory and practice that seeks to replace the growth motive at the center with what I call the well-being motive, that looks at what actually matters for life. And there are many complementary models that are offering the alternative. These are just a few of them: donut economics, steady state economics, feminist, well-being economics, post-growth, ecological economics. They all look at alternatives. This is the end of our presentation. Some references and further reading. You can take a screenshot, or Lina can share the slides with you. So this is what inspired my thinking into coming up with this model. And thank you for your attention.
What you all did was one of the most painful moments in the history of this company.
What the hell? Oh, is anyone there? Is the board on? It's Marquez from Macro.